The blood trail led straight to his well. Tobias Hartwell had seen enough wounded animals in his 37 years on this god-forsaken ranch to know the difference between deer blood and something else entirely. But when he followed those crimson drops around the corner of his barn, what he found made his hand freeze on his rifle. A young Indian warrior lay crumpled against the stone wall of his well. One hand pressed desperately against a gaping wound in his side, the other reaching weakly toward the wooden bucket that hung just 3 feet above his head. The man's breathing came in sharp, painful gasps, and his dark eyes, though clouded with pain, tracked Tobias's every movement with the alertness of someone who expected death to come from any direction. This was 1847. The kind of year when finding an Indian on your property meant one thing: trouble. The kind of trouble that could get a man scalped in his sleep or burned alive in his own home. Every neighbor within 50 miles would tell Tobias the same thing: put a bullet in the savage's head and bury him deep where no one would ever find the body. Tobias raised his rifle, finger hovering over the trigger. The smart thing, the safe thing, the expected thing. But something in those dark eyes stopped him cold. It wasn't just pain he saw there. It was the same desperate thirst he'd felt during the drought of '44, when he'd gone 3 days without water and thought he might die from it. The same human need that transcended skin color, language, or which side of a war you were born into. The Indian tried to speak, his lips cracked and bleeding, but only a whisper came out. Water. The word was barely recognizable, shaped by a mouth that had learned English from traders or missionaries, but the meaning was unmistakable. Tobias lowered his rifle and reached for the bucket. His neighbors would call him a fool. His brother back east would say he'd lost his mind to the frontier loneliness. Hell, maybe they'd be right. But as he knelt beside this wounded stranger and pressed the wooden rim to his lips, watching him drink like a man saved from drowning, Tobias knew one thing for certain: he was about to change both their lives forever. What Tobias didn't know was that this wounded warrior wasn't just any member of the local tribes. And what happened next would bring more riders to his ranch than he'd ever seen in his entire life. The Indian drank like a man who hadn't seen water in days, 3 full buckets before his trembling hands could finally hold the rim steady. Tobias watched every gulp, his mind racing with the implications of what he'd just done. In this territory, showing mercy to an Indian was like signing your own death warrant. But as the color slowly returned to the warrior's face, Tobias noticed something that made his blood run cold. The wound in the man's side wasn't from an animal attack or a hunting accident. It was a bullet hole, fresh, still bleeding. And judging by the angle and the powder burns around the edges, someone had shot him at close range. Recent close range, which meant whoever had done this might still be looking for him. Might be tracking that same blood trail that led straight to Tobias's ranch. Might be riding toward his property right now with guns loaded and questions Tobias couldn't answer. The Indian seemed to sense his fear. With great effort he raised one hand and pointed toward the horizon, then made a cutting motion across his throat. His message was clear. Danger was coming, and soon. Tobias felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Every instinct screamed at him to drag this wounded stranger away from his property, hide the evidence, pretend this never happened. But the man could barely sit up, let alone walk. Moving him now would probably kill him, and leaving him here was like hanging a target on both their backs. That's when Tobias heard it. The sound that had kept him alive through 12 years of frontier living. Hoofbeats in the distance. Multiple horses, riding hard and fast, coming straight toward his ranch. The Indian heard them too. His eyes went wide with what looked like genuine fear, and he tried to push himself up against the well, as if making himself smaller might somehow make him invisible. Blood immediately began seeping through his fingers, where he pressed them against his wound. Tobias grabbed the empty bucket and doused the blood trail as quickly as he could. But there was no time to clean it all. The riders would be here in minutes, maybe less. He looked down at the wounded warrior, this stranger who had stumbled into his life and turned it upside down in the span of a single afternoon. A man whose presence on his ranch could get them both killed, but whose dark eyes held something Tobias had never seen in an Indian before. Gratitude. Pure, human gratitude. The hoofbeats were getting closer now. close enough to count, 5 horses, maybe 6, all moving at a gallop that suggested they weren't coming for a friendly visit. Tobias made his choice in that split second, knowing it might be the last choice he ever made. He couldn't carry the wounded man, but he could hide him. The old root cellar behind the barn, if they could make it that far. But as he reached down to help the Indian to his feet, the warrior grabbed his wrist with surprising strength and shook his head slowly. Then he did something that made Tobias's skin crawl. He smiled. Not the grateful smile of a man being saved, but the knowing smile of someone who understood exactly who was coming over that hill. The riders came over the ridge like a storm cloud, bringing lightning. 6 men on horseback, dust billowing behind them, rifles glinting in the afternoon sun. Tobias recognized the lead rider immediately, Marshal Dixon Webb, a man whose reputation for violence preceded him into every town from here to Santa Fe. Webb was the kind of lawman who shot first and asked questions later, especially when it came to Indian troubles. The kind who collected scalps as trophies and called it justice. The kind who would burn down a ranch and everyone in it if he suspected them of harboring fugitives. Tobias stood in front of the well, his body blocking the Indian from view, trying to look like a man who had nothing more pressing on his mind than fixing a broken fence post. His mouth felt dry as desert sand. Webb reined in his horse just 10 feet away, close enough that Tobias could see the cold calculation in his pale blue eyes. The other 5 men spread out in a semicircle, hands resting on their weapons. This wasn't a social call. The confrontation that would determine whether Tobias lived or died, whether the wounded warrior survived or perished, whether mercy or violence would prevail in this forsaken corner of the frontier. That confrontation was about to begin, and Tobias had no idea that the Indian hiding behind his well was about to reveal a truth that would shake the entire valley to its foundations. Marshal Webb's voice cut through the afternoon heat, like a blade drawn from its sheath. The lawman's pale eyes swept across Tobias's property with the practiced assessment of a predator evaluating terrain. Behind him, the 5 riders maintained their positions, creating a human net that would be impossible to escape. Afternoon, Hartwell. Webb's drawl was lazy, almost friendly, but his hand never strayed far from the pistol at his hip. We're tracking a wounded Indian. Blood trail leads right to your property. Tobias felt sweat beading on his forehead. Despite the cool afternoon air, haven't seen any Indians. Marshal, been working on the south fence all day. Webb's eyes swept across the ranch, taking in every detail with the methodical precision that made him so dangerous. He missed nothing. Not the fresh water stains on the ground near the well. Not the slight disturbance in the dust. Not the way Tobias's body blocked a direct line of sight to the stone wall. That's so. Webb dismounted slowly, deliberately. Because that sure looks like blood to me. He pointed to the dark stains. Tobias hadn't been able to wash away completely. And unless you've been butchering cattle next to your drinking water, I'd say someone's been here recently. Behind Tobias, hidden by the stone wall of the well, the wounded Indian remained perfectly still. But Tobias could feel the tension radiating from him like heat from a forge. One sound, one movement, and they were both dead men. Webb took 3 steps closer, his hand now resting openly on his pistol. You know what the penalty is for harboring Indian fugitives? Don't you, Hartwell? It's the same penalty as for treason, a rope around the neck, until dead. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Tobias felt every muscle in his body coiled tight as a spring, ready to fight or run, knowing neither option would save them. Webb was too close now. Any sudden movement would expose the Indian, and once that happened, bullets would start flying. That's when something impossible happened. The wounded Indian spoke not in English, but in his native tongue, a string of words that flowed like music, clear and strong despite his injuries. Words that made Marshal Webb freeze mid-step, his face draining of color like water from a broken bucket. Webb's hand fell away from his pistol. His mouth opened and closed like a fish, gasping for air. And when he finally found his voice, it came out as barely more than a whisper. Dear God, you're him. The other 5 riders immediately dismounted, their weapons forgotten, their faces showing the same mixture of shock and something that looked almost like fear. But not the kind of fear men show when facing an enemy, the kind of fear men show when they realize they've just made a terrible, terrible mistake. Webb turned to Tobias, his face now pale as winter snow. Do you have any idea who you've been helping? Tobias stared at Marshal Webb's terrified face, his mind spinning like a wagon wheel stuck in mud. In 12 years of frontier living, he'd never seen the ruthless lawmen show fear of anything. Not outlaws, not wild animals, not even the Apache war parties that had burned 3 settlements to ash just last summer. But now Webb looked like a man who'd just seen a ghost. The wounded Indian spoke again, this time in perfect English, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to fill the entire ranch. Tell him who I am, Marshal. Tell him why you rode so hard to find me. Webb's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked like a teenager's. This is Ayana, son of Chief Dakota of the Northern Apache. He's the one who negotiated the peace treaty with Fort Richardson last spring. Tobias felt the ground shift beneath his feet. The peace treaty, the same treaty that had stopped 3 years of brutal warfare between the settlers and the Apache. The same treaty that had saved hundreds of lives on both sides. The same treaty that had made it safe for families to settle in this territory without fear of midnight raids. And he'd been watering the man who'd made it all possible. But if Ayana was a peacemaker, why was he running from the law with a bullet in his side? There was an ambush. Ayana continued, his breathing still labored, but his voice growing stronger with each word. 3 days ago, a meeting with Colonel Morrison about expanding the treaty to include the Southern Territories. But Morrison had other plans. Webb's face went from pale to gray. Colonel Morrison is dead. Shot in the back during an Indian attack 3 days ago. You're wanted for his murder. Because that's what they want you to believe, Ayana said, pushing himself up straighter against the well. Morrison wasn't killed by Indians. He was killed by men wearing war paint, speaking just enough Apache to fool the witnesses. Men who knew exactly when and where we would meet. The implications hit Tobias like a physical blow. Someone had staged Morrison's murder to frame Ayana, someone who wanted the peace treaty destroyed, someone who wanted the territory to burn again. Who? Webb asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected the answer. Ayana's dark eyes hardened like flint. The same men who've been selling guns to the renegade tribes. The same men who've been making a fortune off this war. The same men who sent you to hunt me down instead of looking for the real killers. Webb took a step backward, his hand moving unconsciously toward his weapon before stopping. You're talking about treason, about corruption in the territorial government. Those are serious accusations. And they'll remain accusations until I can prove them, Ayana replied. Which is why they need me dead before I reach the Apache Council tomorrow. Why they put a bullet in me and left me for dead. Why they're counting on men like you to finish what they started. Tobias watched this exchange with growing dread. He'd thought he was just helping a wounded stranger. Instead, he'd stumbled into the middle of a conspiracy that could tear the entire territory apart. But what chilled him most was the realization that if Ayana was telling the truth, then Marshal Webb hadn't come here to arrest a fugitive, he'd come here to commit murder. The silence stretched like a taut rope about to snap. Webb's 5 men shifted nervously in their saddles, hands hovering near weapons, eyes darting between their marshal and the wounded Apache who just accused half the territorial government of murder and treason. Tobias could see the war happening behind Webb's eyes. The marshal was trapped between duty and truth, between orders and conscience. And men like Webb didn't handle moral dilemmas well. They usually solved them with bullets. Even if what you're saying is true, Webb said slowly, his hand tightening on his gun grip, I have my orders. You're wanted for Morrison's murder. I'm supposed to bring you back, dead or alive. Dead would be more convenient, Ayana replied, his voice steady despite the pain etched across his face. Dead men can't testify. Dead men can't reveal who really benefits from another Indian war. One of Webb's men, a young deputy with nervous eyes, leaned forward in his saddle. Marshal, If he's telling the truth about the peace treaty— "Shut up, Bradley," Webb snapped. But Tobias could see doubt creeping into the marshal's expression like cracks in a damn wall. That's when Ayanna played his final card. Reaching into a leather pouch at his belt with trembling fingers, he pulled out a folded piece of paper stained with blood. "This is why they tried to kill me." A letter from Colonel Morrison, written the night before he died. Webb stared at the letter like it might burst into flames. "What does it say?" "It says Morrison discovered who's been supplying weapons to the renegade tribes. Names, dates, amounts." Ayanna's eyes never left Webb's face. Enough evidence to hang a dozen men. Including evidence that someone in the territorial marshal's office has been taking bribes to look the other way. The words hit Webb like a physical blow. His face went through several shades of pale before settling on a sickly green. Behind him, his men exchanged nervous glances, suddenly very interested in examining their horses' manes. "You're lying," Webb said. But his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Ayanna held up the letter. "Morrison trusted me enough to give me this the night he died. Told me to get it to Fort Richardson, if anything happened to him. Said it was insurance." Webb took a step forward, his hand now gripping his pistol. "So you can destroy it?" Ayanna shook his head. "I don't think so, Marshal. But I'll make you a deal. Let me live long enough to reach the Apache Council tomorrow. And I'll make sure your name isn't mentioned when this all comes to light." The offer hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Tobias could see Webb calculating odds, weighing risks, trying to figure out which choice would keep him alive longer. But what happened next surprised everyone. Deputy Bradley dismounted and walked slowly toward the well, his hands raised peacefully. "Marshal, I've been thinking about something. Remember that shipment of rifles that went missing 3 months ago? The one we were told was stolen by Indians?" Webb's face darkened. "What about it?" "I saw those same rifles 2 weeks later." Bradley's young face flushed with either courage or fear in the hands of settlers heading south. "Made me wonder who was really stealing from who." The admission cracked something open in the group. Suddenly other deputies were nodding, sharing glances, remembering things that hadn't made sense at the time. And Tobias realized that Ayanna had just done something remarkable without firing a shot or raising his voice. He'd turned Webb's own men against him. The standoff had shifted in ways no one could have predicted. And as the sun climbed toward noon, burning away the last morning shadows, the truth about corruption, conspiracy, and the real cost of peace was about to explode across the valley like wildfire. Webb's hand tightened on his pistol grip until his knuckles went white. A cornered animal was always the most dangerous, and Tobias could see the exact moment when the marshal decided that bullets were simpler than truth. "You're all fools," Webb snarled, his mask of civility finally slipping away. "You think this savage's word means anything against mine? You think anyone will believe the testimony of a dead Indian and a handful of traitors?" His voice hardened. "What is illegal is forming a lynch mob. So unless someone can give me actual evidence of an actual crime, you boys are going home now." The farmer's face flushed red. "You're just gonna let this stand? Let Pratt keep that thing on his land." "That thing," Gideon said, his voice dangerously quiet, "is my wife. Show some respect or get off my property." Several settlers actually flinched at the word wife. Martha, the woman whose son had been saved, looked like she might be sick. Marshal Keene's eyebrows rose slightly. "Your wife? Is that legal? Witnessed and binding?" Taza confirmed. 5 minutes ago. A hasty ceremony, but recognized by territorial law regarding indigenous marriages. Keene nodded slowly. "Then it's settled. These folks are married. What they do on their own land is their business." He fixed the settlers with a hard stare. "Anyone got a problem with that? Take it up with a judge, not with rifles and pitchforks." The mob shifted uncertainly, their righteous anger deflating under the weight of actual authority. Without the fuel of mob mentality, they were just frightened neighbors who'd let fear override reason. "This isn't over," the farmer muttered, but he was already turning his horse around. "Yeah, it is," Keene replied. "And if I hear about anyone bothering the Pratts, I'll be back and I won't be polite." The settlers dispersed slowly, shooting dark looks over their shoulders but lacking the courage to defy a territorial marshal. Within minutes they were gone, leaving only dust and the memory of how close everything had come to violence. Keeney watched them go, then turned to Tobias. "You know what you've done? Made a choice," Tobias said. "Made yourself an outcast," Keen corrected. "Those settlers won't forget, won't forgive. You'll be welcome nowhere within 50 miles. Then we'll go somewhere else." The marshal studied him for a long moment, then surprised Tobias by almost smiling. "Stubborn. Good. You'll need it." He looked at Ayanna. "You got lucky finding this one, son. Most men would have let that mob have you just to save their own skin." "I know," Ayanna said quietly. Keen mounted his horse, preparing to leave, then paused. "There's territory opening up further west, past the mineral claims. Good land, plenty of water, far enough from settlements that folks won't bother you much." He adjusted his reins. Just a suggestion from someone who's seen too many good people destroyed by bad neighbors. With that, he rode off, leaving Tobias and Ayanna standing in the settling dust of what could have been a massacre. The crisis had passed, but both men knew that the real work of building trust across two cultures had only just begun. Tobias looked at the wounded man who'd stumbled into his life less than 24 hours ago and changed everything. The stranger who'd brought violence to his doorstep, but also revealed the depths of his own character. "What happens now?" Tobias asked. Ayanna managed a weak smile despite his pain. "Now we find out if mercy can be stronger than hatred. If one act of kindness can overcome years of fear. If two men from different worlds can build something that lasts." As the sun climbed toward its zenith, burning away the last shadows of doubt and violence, Tobias Hartwell realized that giving water to a dying man had been the easiest part. Living up to what that simple act represented would be the real challenge. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was part of something larger than his lonely ranch and his isolated existence. Sometimes the most dangerous thing a man could do wasn't picking up a weapon. It was choosing compassion when the world demanded cruelty. And sometimes that choice changed everything.